We've had some movement this offseason defensively, not only from new faces and new places via free agency, but also because coaches have changed, and coaching is a huge way that fantasy defenses get scores. So make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to share your support as we get into these top 12 defense rankings for fantasy football 2025. So get into our first tier right here. I've got the Texans defense at number 1, and I just think they kind of speak for themselves based on coaching and based on personnel. You know, they did not have a bunch of movement in free agency like a lot of these other teams did have. The Texans basically are returning all of their starters defensively, and that includes their higher end guys. Guys like Will Anderson, guys like their middle linebacking crew. They've got a solid front seven and a really good back four as well, with guys like Derek Stingley in the secondary. Their coaching staff is returning. D'Amico Ryan's obviously running this defense as he did with San Francisco when he was their defensive coordinator years back. And I just think when you actually look at numbers from last year, the Houston Texans only had 6.9 fantasy points per game, but they had a long stretch there where they looked really good defensively. And I just think with that group back, with D'Amico Ryan's back for his third year as the head coach, they're going to make strides again this year. And I feel similarly about the Ravens at number 2. To cap off this tier right here, I think the Ravens are going to be excellent defensively in fantasy this year. Look, the Ravens, they had a really bad start to 2024. That was because Zach Orr was a new defensive coordinator. His first time defensive coordinator, former player. And he just didn't get off to a great start. You know, they were not getting the splash plays that were needed. Kyle Hamilton was all over the field, and that wasn't really working out for them defensively. They were giving up a ton of points doing that. But then they really turned those last 8 to 10 games of the season, and they started having Kyle Hamilton play deep safety. And that's when everything just kind of fell into place. And that number, 5.4 fantasy points per game, it's not true to their last 8 or 10. They had a really good stretch run there when it really mattered most. So with the Ravens here, again, very similar to the Texans, basically they're returning their starters. They really don't have any arrivals or departures that are noteworthy here. So I just think that the Ravens and the Texans, another year with the same coordinator, with the same scheme, with the same exact personnel, you're going to have some growth there. Dropping down to our next tier, I've got the Broncos defense at number 3 right here. And I think the Broncos, obviously last year they were a great defensive play, right? Most of the time, the Broncos' schedule was really good, and they just had a really good defense last year compared to everything that they had years prior with the Broncos. 9 fantasy points per game, 3.5 sacks per game. They led the league in sack volume, and they really didn't get too many turnovers as compared to like the Ravens defense, but they just came through on sacks so much because that front seven was so dominant. Nothing's really changing in that front seven except making some massive moves. 2 of them in particular, Talanoa Hufanga and Dre Greenlaw from the San Francisco 49ers, a safety and a linebacker. And if both of those guys can stay healthy, those 2 guys are all pro/Pro Bowl level players. This is going to be huge for their defense. If they can stay healthy, they'll get turnovers from guys like Talanoa Hufanga and get some more sacks/turnovers from a guy like Dre Greenlaw. So I just think you put it all together, same coaching staff again, same defensive coordinator, same scheme, add in a couple elite players when healthy, you're going to have some good moments here with the Broncos in 2025. And at number 4, I've got the Vikings defense. And I just think that their defense last year spoke for themselves, obviously. They were an elite defense fantasy football-wise. 12 fantasy points per game, 3.3 sacks per game, and basically, that's 2 turnovers per game. Like, that's a crazy number, almost 4. Like, their defense on a per-game basis was electric, man. But they did not go into this offseason very clean. Like, they lost some guys, man. They lost Cam Bynum, who is a really good safety for them. They lost Jerry Tillery on that front seven. They lost Patrick Jones on that front seven as well. Now, they did make some moves in free agency to kind of minimize that impact, getting Byron Murphy at cornerback, getting Jonathan Allen on the D-tackle spot when the Commanders released him, and getting Javon Hargrave as well. So I do think that there's possibilities here that a great defensive coordinator like a Brian Flores can work with those pieces and mesh those pieces really well. But I do see some pullback here. And that's why I've got the Vikings here at number 4. And the Eagles defense at number 5, also in this tier. The Eagles defense looks really, really great, right? If you just look at what their playoff run was like, what they were like in the Super Bowl. But you have to remember this, guys. I know I'm going to get some pushback for having Eagles at 5. Why aren't they at number 1? They're so good. Guys, the Eagles defense, 8.1 fantasy points per game last year. Not bad, but if you don't remember, the Eagles were the defense number 7 last year. Like, they were not fantastic defensively. Now, I get it. The Eagles defense is definitely a defense that you want, right? They're going to be a good defense because they have such great personnel. They have Vic Fangio as the defensive coordinator. I'm not trying to stray you away. I'm just saying that they didn't have the big plays that really matter in fantasy, which is sacks and turnovers, either through interceptions or through fumbles. So that's the big stuff that they just didn't get consistently last year for enough of the season. They lost some pieces as well. They lost Milton Williams at that middle defensive tackle spot. Josh Sweat off the edge. Darius Slay, not a huge loss. They lost Oren Burks, Isaiah Rodgers. They're getting Adoree Jackson, but that's basically it. But you can kind of do that if you're the Eagles because that's the benefit of drafting so well, which the Eagles have done. They've got guys in place to fill all those slots, basically, so they don't have tons of concerns, and I'm sure they're going to make some draft moves as well. I trust the Eagles. I trust their scouting department. I trust what they're doing defensively. That's why they're at 5. And at number 6 to round out this tier, I love the Rams defense. I think the Rams defense is going to be a major pop this year. The Rams defense ended relatively strong, and they had a good run there in the middle of the season. They had some bad moments too, though. And I think it's important to note, and we'll get into the reasons why here in a minute, but they had 8 fantasy points per game, 2.6 sacks per game, and 2 turnovers per game. They had a really good stretch run, though. And I think the reason why it's important for me to say that they were very streaky last year is because they were young. They had great defensive players that were rookies. Jared Verse off the edge. That guy's going to be a freaky edge rusher for years to come. They've got other guys on that young front 7. Like, this is a young defense that played aggressive last year. They had streaks that they were absolutely animalistic, and they were a big reason why the Vikings in that playoff game couldn't get anything going. So I just have tons of confidence in the Rams and what they're doing defensively. They lost Bobby Brown. They lost an outside linebacker, but they got Poona Ford to kind of help out with losing Bobby Brown. I think the Rams are on a great track here to be a great defense again. Dropping down to our next tier, I've got the Seahawks defense at number 7 starting out this tier. And I think the Seahawks defense is also on a similar trajectory that the Rams defense is on. Because when you look at the Seahawks defense, also extremely young, extremely fast, extremely physical as well, and also had really good and bad moments last year too. 7.2 fantasy points per game, 2.3 sacks per game, 0.7 interceptions per game, but their fumbles recovered were not good enough. That's just not a good enough number, and sometimes, that's just a little bit tough to kind of go on the same scale as you're forcing fumbles. I get it, but the reality is that they were just not consistent enough defensively for me to get super excited about and rank them too much higher. Now, obviously, they've got developing young players. Devon Witherspoon at the cornerback position. They've got a bunch of youth up front. They're getting DeMarcus Lawrence. That's a big signing for them. I'm kind of curious to see how that one plays out in particular because I know I've never been the biggest DeMarcus Lawrence guy. I get it. He's good. He's been good, but I just kind of think maybe his prime is up. They're losing Draymond Jones and Roy Robertson Harris on that front 7. So I'm interested to see how that front 7 particularly plays. I don't know if they're going to get a ton more sacks this year, but I trust Mike McDonald, and that's why I've got them at 7. And at number 8, I've got the Bills defense. Listen, guys, the Bills every year, I rank the Bills. I get flack for ranking the Bills inside the top 10 or the top 12. Here's something for you guys, man. The Bills defense, since 2019, has had top 10 seasons. 6 straight top 10 finishes in fantasy football on defense. They're a good defense, man. And that's because Sean McDermott is a defense-first head coach. He wants to make sure that defense is running smooth. That's a big thing for Sean McDermott. So when you look at the Bills' depth chart, it doesn't look like they have tons of depth, right? There's not a ton of big-name players, although they are adding some important pieces, I would say. They're losing Von Miller. He was past his prime. They're losing their first-round pick, Kyer Elam, but he didn't amount to anything. Micah Hyde retired as well, but they're getting depth at that front 7. Michael Holt off the edge. Joey Bosa off the edge. Larry Ogunjobi. Derek Forrest at safety. Dane Jackson at corner. They added some guys, man, so they're not going anywhere defensively. I get it. I guess it's been so long since the Bills haven't been inside the top 10 that people get fatigued with the Bills, but the Bills are well-run defensively. They always make sure they get the big plays that they need for fantasy football, such as turnovers, right? 1.1 interceptions per game, 1.1 fumbles recovered per game. That amounts to 8.8 fantasy points per game. Sorry, guys, the Bills defense is just not going anywhere. And at number 9, to round out this tier, I've got the Chargers defense right here. Look, the Chargers defense, there's a lot to be said about the leap that they made last year, because the Chargers defense, player personnel-wise, was very similar to what it was in 2023 when they were horrific playing for a guy like Brandon Staley. He's a fraud. So Jim Harbaugh comes in, that's a real coach, and then they immediately just turn on the Jets, and they're a top 12 defense in fantasy. That's not a coincidence. That's why coaching is so important for defense in fantasy football. Well, they still got Harbaugh, obviously. They got guys like Dante Jackson. They got guys like Deshaun Hand at that front seven. They're losing Joey Bosa, Poona Ford, Christian Fulton at cornerback and at the edge and at the front seven. I think that it's going to be just one of those things where the Chargers, for me, until that they make, let a Khalil Mack walk or let a Derwin James walk, I don't think that they're going to be outside the top 12. I think they just are going to make too many plays in that front seven. Since Jim Harbaugh values the front seven physicality so much, I see them having another top 12 year. 9.6 fantasy points per game. That's a stretch this year. I don't know if they're going to hit that number, but I see them having a good season. Now, dropping down to our last tier, I've got the Pittsburgh Steelers at number 10. I have a love-hate relationship with the Steelers. I hate what they do offensively. I hate what they do personnel-wise in general. I hate their coaching at this point. But the reality is that the Steelers are top 12 defense basically every year. 6 out of the last 8 seasons, top 12 defense. Steelers do it. That's just what they do. Now, their personnel I don't think is particularly impressive. They're aging, right? Cam Hayward's obviously on his way out. He's in his mid-30s. Guys like Minkah Fitzpatrick, he is definitely not in his prime anymore. Joey Porter Jr., definitely a good spot. TJ Watt, though, on his last year of his contract, very underreported. He's on his last year of the contract, so what are they going to do with him? I kind of have some suspicions there, but the Steelers, they get Darius Slay. They think that's a good signing. I don't agree personally. And then they get Malik Harrison in the linebacker spot. They lose Landon Roberts, who I liked, and Larry Ogunjobi. The Steelers are going to make plays. That's what they're going to do. They're going to get the big splash plays that make them fantasy relevant. They're going to get turnovers. They're going to get sacks. That's what they do. It's Blitzburg, man. So they're going to be a boring top 12, top 10 defense in fantasy. And that's why I just really am tired of them more than I'm tired of the Bills. At number 11, the Bears defense here. Now, the Bears defense is an interesting one, right? Because the Bears defense came into last year and they were firing all cylinders. They finished as a top 3 defense as well. The Chicago Bears had a really good season in fantasy football. 2.7 sacks per game, 8.9 fantasy points per game, almost an interception per game, almost a fumble recovered per game. They had a lot of splash moments. Things really fell off for them at the end there, especially after that Hail Mary that they executed so perfectly. But the Bears defense, the one thing I am concerned about is, I'm not saying Matt Eberflus was a good head coach. The guy does know how to run a defense, though. So they lose a guy like that. But they bring in Dennis Allen. So Dennis Allen, I do think, at the defensive coordinator spot, is going to be a big plus for the Chicago Bears and help them stabilize kind of what they were losing at the defensive edge with Matt Eberflus. So I like that hiring right there. They get some pieces to shore up the front seven. Grady Jarrett, and they get another defensive end. They don't lose a ton of pieces. I think the Bears actually do end up having another top 12 season fantasy football-wise, but it will be interesting to see now that they're moving towards a more offense-first culture, how much they prioritize defense, particularly in the draft. And then to round out the whole thing, I've got the Packers defense at number 12. I think the Packers defense can't be overlooked, right? The Packers defense last year did have a lot of up and down moments as well. They were the number 11 defense, but they made plays, man. They made tons of plays. 2.4 sacks per game, not a bad number. Basically 2 turnovers per game. Interceptions per game at 1.1, fumble recoveries per game at 1. This defense made plays. And I get it. They definitely tapered off towards the back half of the season. Their schedule got a little bit rougher. 8.9 fantasy points per game is what they settled at. But at one time, actually for a lot of the season, they were bordering on number 2, number 1, number 3 defense overall because they had a dominant stretch. The Packers defense is very, very young. They're not letting much talent go. They let a defensive tackle go, but you probably don't even know who that guy was. And then they get Nate Hobbs at cornerback. They're not losing many guys. They're young. They're going to continue to grow. I think they've got the right defensive coordinator in there. I think they're going to be another good defense in fantasy this year. So let me know where your head's at to start 2025. And if you want to see the top 30 running back rankings for 2025 fantasy football, click on this video right here.